You've selected the full watercolor tutorial. Here by mistake, click the I in the upper right-hand corner to go to the introduction video of this Choose Your Own Adventure Paint With Me to get all the details. But if you're looking for the in-depth tutorial on how I created these two paintings, along with a healthy dose of tips and tricks for beginners with watercolors, you're in the right place. Let's get started by collecting all of our materials. First, you're going to need watercolor paper. I'm using this Strathmore Vision watercolor paper, which is cold-pressed, acid-free 140-pound paper. You'll also need clean water, watercolor paints, watercolor brushes, painter's tape, a palette for mixing, and some paper towel. I started by cutting a rectangle of watercolor paper from a larger sheet. Now I'm going to use my painter's tape to tape the watercolor paper down to my table. This is helpful for a number of reasons. 1, it means your paper's not going to shift as you're painting. 2, it helps to stop your paper from buckling quite so much under the pressure of the water. And 3, it helps to give you a nice clean edge. I highly suggest that you get some of the stickiness out of your tape before you tape it down on your paper. Otherwise, you risk ripping the paper when you remove the tape. This will depend on the exact type of tape you use, but I usually try to stick and unstick the tape at least 4 or 5 times before I place it down on the paper. Now that we have our supplies ready and our paper taped down, it's time to mix our paint for a flat wash. I want to do a flat wash for the background of both of these paintings. Flat washes can be pretty hard to do as a beginner with watercolor. I know I still struggle with them, but I have learned a few things over time that have helped me to get more consistent, smooth, and even flat washes. The first thing to keep in mind is that you want to mix more than enough pigment with water to cover your whole area before you start. Watercolor can dry pretty quickly, and you don't want to let it dry when you've only done half the wash, because you're going to end up with inconsistent results, streakiness, and areas that are darker than others. You'll also probably want to make your mixture quite watery. Remember that watercolor is a medium that can be layered, so if you want a darker wash, you can always go back in and do future layers later. It's best to try to get consistent, even layers, even if they're more transparent than you want for your final result. I'm starting by mixing yellow ochre, which is this darker mustard yellow color from my palette, with a whole lot of water to get a nice, light, warm yellow to use across the surface. I'm starting in the top left-hand corner and sweeping the pigment across the page and moving my way down in even strokes. I'm picking up more pigment as needed. I probably could have used even a little more water to get an even more consistent, smooth result, but I'm quite happy with having a little bit of variety here and there, because that's part of what I love the most about watercolor is its organic, irregular quality. For my other painting, I'm mixing yellow ochre with my white watercolor to get a slightly lighter shade, and doing the same thing. A fundamental aspect of watercolor that you want to keep in mind is that you need to have the patience to let your layers fully dry before moving on to the next. I cannot tell you how many paintings I've ruined by being impatient and starting on my next layer before the last one is fully dry. So give it time, walk away, set a timer on your phone for at least 15 minutes, come back and check it, leave again. Don't tempt yourself by sitting, staring at your painting, waiting for it to be ready for the next layer, because you're more than likely going to go too quick and ruin your painting. Something I like to do if I'm feeling super impatient is to give the layer time to dry, and once it's almost completely dry but still has that tiny bit of dampness to it, I'll pick up my hairdryer and just blow some warm air over the painting to finish the drying process. Beware, do not do this while the paint is newly wet, because you will blow the pigment across the page and ruin your painting. I am telling you this from experience. Let the layer dry significantly before you pull out your blow dryer. Feel free to use this time while you wait for your paint to dry to replace your water. This is a common mistake, to just never replace the water you're painting with, but you'll get much better results if you frequently replace the used, dirtied water with nice, fresh, clean water. Once the background has completely dried, it's time to start on this mountain in the center of the page. For my mountain, I'm using yellow ochre again, with a little bit of water to dampen the brush and activate the paint, but not nearly as much water as we used for the wash. This is going to create a much darker, more opaque color. And this is another basic property of watercolor. The more water you add, the more transparent your pigment will become. The less water you add, the more opaque your pigment will be. I'm still using a good amount of water because I don't want any dry brush effects, and I want to keep it relatively smooth. This is something that's hard to quantify, the difference between a lot of water and a normal amount of water and a tiny amount of water. It is obviously incredibly subjective, so I highly recommend, if you're getting into watercolor, that you play around with your pigments and your brush. Get to know your specific paints, how your brushes interact with your paints and your paper, and try out different washes and drawing different shapes or even just streaks of paint with different amounts of water, just to get a feel for how that transparency factor comes in with your specific supplies. While the first layer of the mountain is drying, I'm going to work on the sun. I mixed my yellow ochre, which is that darker, more mustardy yellow, with the lighter yellow in my palette, which is lemon yellow, to get more of a true primary yellow shade. So for this, I'm starting by using my circle template and a yellow Crayola to get a perfect circle. You don't have to do this if you're good at freehanding a circle. Go for it with your paint, but I decided to do this first because I really wanted to get it as close to a perfect circle as possible. I wouldn't recommend using pencil for this because once you paint over pencil, you can't erase it. Now I'm going over the marker with this yellow I mixed. I'm using a larger brush to fill in the majority of the area of the sun, and then using a fine detail brush to get the edges. Once I finished the sun, the base of the mountain was dry enough that I was ready to do my next layer. The shaded side is on the opposite side of the sun and is clearly getting less light. So on this side, I'm going to use burnt sienna, which is this nice rusty orange shade. I'm doing the same thing, using enough water to try to get a smooth coverage without using too much water because I don't want to activate our first layer of paint. I'm starting at the point and drawing a reverse S curve down the front of the mountain and filling in the whole right side. Once that area is filled in, I'm going to move on to the next painting. I wanted to add a little bit more pigment to the background of this painting, so I mixed my yellow ochre with some white gouache I had left in my palette to get this nice light beige color to go over that background of the second painting to get more opaque coverage while still keeping the shade quite light. Gouache is also a water-based paint, like watercolor, but it's more opaque in nature. So when you're using a gouache, you're going to find it has lower transparency than regular watercolor paints. White gouache is often used in watercolor painting for highlights, but it can also be helpful to lighten shades and up their opacity at the same time. Whereas typically when you're lightening a shade with watercolor, you'll add more water, which will make the shade lighter, but will also make the paint more transparent. Of course, as always, you want to let the background fully dry before you paint anything else on it. Give your layers more time to dry than you think they need. I promise you, you will regret it if you don't. I mixed together more of my yellow mix, which is the lemon yellow and the yellow ochre, to get a nice bright yellow to create the sun on the second painting. For this sun, I wanted it to be much larger, and for a challenge for myself, I decided to try to paint it freehand. As you can see, it is not a perfect circle, but I did my best. You can also see that I didn't add quite enough pigment in some of the center sections, and this sun ends up drying a little bit patchy. Again, I don't personally mind because I actually really enjoy that quality of watercolor, the sort of irregular textures that come out just with the way the pigment reacts to water. But if you're not a fan of that, you're going to want to make sure you get a nice, smooth, even coverage while the paint is still wet. Once I gave the sun time to dry, I went in to create my first desert wave. This is actually the exact same shade I mixed for the background, so a mix of white gouache and yellow ochre, but with a lot less water, so it's more opaque. It also makes it a little bit darker. Once that first wave dried, I went in to create my second wave. For this one, I used the same base, this beige I created with white gouache and yellow ochre watercolor, but I added quite a bit more yellow ochre to make it darker. While that second wave is drying, I mixed my second shade. I was going to mix my burnt sienna with the shade I had pre-mixed, but I found it ended up being a little bit too light and just wasn't exactly what I was going for. I ended up adding quite a bit more pure burnt sienna to make the color darker and more vibrant. Once again, I let that wave completely dry. For my next shade, I wanted to make a nice dark warm brown. So for this nice dark warm brown, I'm mixing my burnt sienna, which is this orangey shade, with raw umber, which is a nice dark brown out of the tube, and adding just the tiniest touch of my previous mix, that sort of browny beige shade. For this one, I made the mistake that I did not mix enough before I started, and this left me with a layer that was pretty inconsistent. I should have mixed more than enough paint to cover the area before I started, but I did not do that, and it ended up more inconsistent than I wanted. Once that layer was fully dry, it was time for our final wave along the bottom. I decided to mix my raw umbers, the dark brown from the tube, with some black from my palette to get an almost black, really dark, warm brown. And of course, let that layer fully dry. And that was the final layer of the second painting. Again, I like the sort of natural irregularity of watercolor, so I like to leave areas that are darker and areas that are lighter. I like those inconsistencies. I like when little areas kind of pool with more water and end up getting a little darker or a little lighter. To me, that makes watercolor interesting. It's a reason to use watercolor rather than doing, say, digital art where you can have a fully perfectly consistent color. Some of that is my preference, and some of that is just my skill level. As I said, I'm still what I would consider an intermediate when it comes to watercolor. I've learned a lot of the absolute basics, but I am nowhere near an expert. So I would love to know if you have any tips and tricks for me. Maybe you know more about watercolor than I do. I wouldn't be surprised. I would love to hear your advice in the comments. Or if you're new to watercolor or have never tried it, if you have some questions, if there are things that I didn't touch on that you would really like to know, feel free to leave your questions down below, and myself or someone else watching this video will be happy to help you out. I really hope this in-depth tutorial was helpful for all of you. I hope it gave you a starting point if you've been interested in trying watercolors. But I tend to think that the best way to learn about watercolors is to just jump in and start playing with them. That's what I did, and that's what I still continue to do every time I have an idea for something I want to make. Often I come up with an idea for something I want to make, and it involves a technique that I haven't done before, and in creating the art I want to create, I'm learning a lot about different aspects of watercolor and different ways to use the medium. For these paintings, I was exclusively using wet on dry, so using a wet brush with pigment on it on a dry piece of paper. But as I've mentioned in previous videos, there are other techniques with watercolor. You can paint wet on wet, so a wet brush on wet paper. You can paint dry on dry with a relatively dry brush on dry paper, and all three of these options will give you different results. I highly recommend you check out Skillshare if you're looking for some in-depth beginner classes on watercolor. I've taken a couple classes on Skillshare for watercolor that I've found really helpful. This video isn't sponsored. I just legitimately have learned a lot from Skillshare when it comes to watercolor. So I'll link Skillshare in the description box if you want to try some more classes, if this has kind of piqued your interest or whet your appetite when it comes to watercolor. And those instructors over there know a million times more than I do about watercolor and can really take you to the next level. So that is it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting and informative. Don't forget there are 2 other versions of this video, one with just music and one with myself reading fairy tales. If you're looking for something a little more relaxing, something to help you decompress, please let me know if you liked the concept of this video, this choose your own adventure style. I got this idea from Chandler, who is a booktuber I enjoy, who did this kind of choose your own adventure reading vlog that I thought was incredibly innovative and fun. I will link her choose your own adventure reading vlog in the description box if you want to see what inspired this video concept. And before I go, I want to thank my patrons for their support. Extra special thanks to our newest patrons, Christine, Minerva, Tam, Kira, Shamra, Amanda, and Bjorg. Welcome all of you to the squad. I am so excited to have you. If you at home want to join the squad, feel free. There's a link in the card and in the description box down below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends.